And of course, we are certainly looking forward to a very exciting panel discussion coming right up after that keynote. And we have a brilliant panel of esteemed panelists who will be joining us in just a minute while we set the stage. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists on stage. Starting with Som Shantanu, President Engineering Asia Gas Power GE Vernova. And joining Som, we have Sharad Somani, Partner, Head of Infrastructure Advisory, Head of Infrastructure Asia Pacific, and Head of ESG Consulting KPMG in Singapore. We're also pleased to have with us Datuk Shabini Suhaili, Group Chief Executive Officer, Sarawak Energy. We're also happy to have Roberto Lorato, Director and Chief Executive Officer, Medco Energy. And rounding off this panel, we have Ganesh Padmanabhan, Managing Director, Head of Project Finance, DBS Bank. And of course, to take us through this panel, we'd like to invite our moderator, Ms. Paula Conboy, Senior Counsel, Sussex Strategy Group, on stage.
Thank you very much. I love the way you introduce us. The enthusiasm.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
I love that green blouse as well. Very
well.
in theme.
It's the theme, isn't it?
It is.
It's
It's absolutely perfect. It couldn't be any better. So without further ado, Paula, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today on what is promised to be a very exciting panel. And really interesting in terms of how we keep building. All the panels are building on each other. So the session one that we had, I just kept on wanting to talk further. And I thought, well, wait a minute, we are going to get an opportunity to explore this further. In good SIEW style, we're going to hop right into questions because, of course, we don't have a whole lot of time with these sessions. So I'd actually like to throw over to Datuk Sharbini first, please, to perhaps do a little scene setting, if you like, and then I'll pose the first question to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And, the Southeast Asia region is blessed with ample energy resources, particularly renewable energy. And I think it's up to each of the member states to develop that resource and to be able to share that with their neighbors to ensure that the whole region can transition to a low carbon economy. So we, in Sarawak Energy, we believe that we need to set the example, and we have been doing that by looking at an interconnected Borneo to start with. So we have been championing the Borneo grid and sharing our energy resources with our neighbors in Borneo. And hopefully after that we'll extend it to the region as well. And we believe that the island of Borneo, together Malaysia and Indonesia, we have plenty of renewable energy resources that we could share, and we could become the battery of ASEAN in helping the whole region transition.
Thank you very much. And we heard before, of course, from some, how to get project financing, and I'd like to get into that a little bit more, and the partnerships with government. But up on the stage here, we also have those who put the kit in the ground. And I'd actually like again to start with you, Mr. Sharbini, in terms of what do you see are the key challenges, but also those opportunities in developing critical infrastructure? So like the subsea cables, we've had some discussion. And how might they be effectively addressed?
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned earlier on, I think there is a lot of opportunities with the ample renewable energy resources we have in the region. We have plenty of hydropower, solar, wind, and geothermal, and biomass as well, energy resources in the region. And on the demand side, there is a marked shift and an increased demand for renewable energy. I think you can see that countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam have made a commitment for net zero emission or carbon neutrality by 2050. And many governments have put in place the energy policy, the increase of renewable energy part. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But the challenges is many as well. I think it's been discussed throughout this week. And if you look at Southeast Asia as a region, we are made up of lots of islands. Yeah, we have many islands, and Southeast Asia is home to about 25,000 islands, and they are spread over a vast area, about 4.5 million square kilometers. And mentioned early on in the early session as well, the various economies are at various phases of the development. So affordability is quite key for us. And so if we want to realize a regional or ASEAN power grid, and because of the many islands, we can also call it archipelago power grid. We need to ensure that we develop a power grid system powered by renewable energy in a diverse and geographically expansive region. And that in itself actually you can see that it will lead to high costs and challenges in bankability, and as well as political. And to me, political is one of the biggest issues that we need to manage.
We never want to talk about.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the way of doing that is that I think the ASEAN countries need to work together and form what they call a very effective, comprehensive framework to facilitate the development of this interconnection across the region.
And speaking of facilitating, Sharad, KPMG, we were whispering to each other earlier, I sort of see you as a bit of the dating agency in terms of bringing a lot of the utilities together. So you do a lot of work with generators in Singapore and utilities across the region. Perhaps you can, you're in bringing together and maybe talk about the hub. You've got a really good insight into where those challenges and opportunities are in different areas. If you could share a bit.
Yeah, sure, Paula, thanks for that. Indeed, I mean, just to set the stage, Southeast Asia has got a great opportunity to be the manufacturing hub for the whole world, isn't it? And with the young population, fast-growing economy, diverse resources, as you highlighted, we can actually get into a lot of green manufacturing. In fact, some estimates say that our total renewable energy potential in the region is 40 times our total installed capacity, if we can tap it, right? So there's no dearth of renewable options. The challenge, I guess, is how do we work collaboratively as one region to address that issue? And that's where at KPMG we have this ASEAN Decarbonization Hub, because we believe decarbonization is not a country-specific challenge, it's actually a regional challenge. And as you rightly highlighted, if we can get the huge renewable energy from Borneo to be transferred to the region, we all can benefit. And that's where the ASEAN grid discussion becomes very important. But the broad three areas where I believe we need to work collaboratively, first is more than 80% of our power is fossil fuel based, and that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. I guess, as the previous panel discussed, we need to start proactively thinking about retiring them in the next 10 to 15 years. We don't want them to run for 40 years, isn't it? So that's the first step. And that's where the energy transition mechanism work that KPMG is doing with Asian Development Bank becomes important. And I think all the ecosystem of players have to come together to come up with options on transition financing, transition credits, and ensuring that the coal plants are retired faster than their original life. The second issue is getting marginal renewable energy projects on stream. There's a lot of financing available for solar, wind, which are commercially viable. We need to start thinking about BESS project, the battery projects which will supplement solar, which are not still commercially viable, are marginal, which is where the blended financing and institutional capital will come in. So that's the second pillar we need to work on. And the third pillar, I would say, is the transmission strengthening is the most important thing. I mean, transmission infrastructure strengthening, right? This has been discussed since morning today, and I think it cannot be overemphasized that a strong grid will help us offtake all the renewable energy that's getting generated in the region. And these three things can potentially lay the framework for decarbonizing the entire region.
Thank you. Some of those projects that you're talking about are actually sit quite nicely with Medco Energy, and we've got Roberto with us. And for those of you who have not gone to see the displays yet, I do encourage you to go and have a look at them, because what I'm going to ask Roberto to share with us, you can actually see visually in those displays. And of course, Sarawat as well has a fabulous display. So Roberto, perhaps you could share a bit of what you're doing to, your company's doing to assist in that interconnectivity in the region.
Thank you, Paula, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, if you allow me 3 minutes to introduce a bit of Medco Energy, because this is, you're talking about energy transition. We are an energy company in transition, meaning 8 years ago, this was a company which was pretty much a traditional oil and gas company. Over the last 8 years, we become a company which is mainly exposed to gas production. Today is 70% of our total oil and gas production in the region and outside. But in the past 8 years, we also started investing more aggressively in power generation, gas IPP first, but then substantial real investments in the ground on geothermal and solar power. And we are already operating directly large projects of geothermal and solar power in Indonesia. The third element, which is quite peculiar, I think, amongst our peers, is that we also have made large investments in mining. But mining what? Mining copper. We are one of the key investors, shareholders of Aman, which is a very, very large copper mining operations in Indonesia. And so you see, we have been trying to design, to position ourselves over time, transition is still progressing, but as a company that will try and play across the board during this period, upcoming period of energy transition. Gas, power, renewables, some investments in critical elements for the electrification. If it is true that energy transition means electrification. Someone else then will say that we heard earlier, energy transition means transmission, and we got a connection there. I would say, and then I'll go talk a little bit more about the experiences, really energy transition to me means cooperation, collaboration. In relation to Singapore, in fact, we have three key elements of our interaction with Singapore. We are the largest supplier of gas to Singapore today, which is still critical for the power generation. We are part of a consortium, one of the 5 projects in Indonesia that were awarded conditional license to import power into Indonesia. So our Bulan project aims to develop, produce, and import into Singapore 600 megawatt of solar power. And then the third element is the really advanced studies we already have conducting on the potential to store long-term CO2 produced in the region, for example, in Singapore, into the reservoirs that we operate offshore between Singapore and Indonesia. And those are I think, the examples you were referring to that you can see at our booth.
You've got the great diversification and being able to do that sort of cross-cost benefit analysis in terms of the type of service. And I'm going to pass to Sam and put you on notice in terms of all of this is going to have to get financed some way. From GE Vernova's perspective, in terms of the competing technologies and the complementary technologies, because as we have heard before in our previous panel, and I'm sure we're going to again when we talk into how is this all going to get paid for and funded, we really need to have a good handle on where are we going to put those bets. So over to you, Sam, please.
No, thank you, Paula, for that. And I'll piggyback to something, Roberto, you said, and Sharad, you said. The energy market we are in today is very interesting. One side, we have a massive growth opportunity. The other side, there's a demand and responsibility to decarb. Now, when you do that equation, it's very obvious on the capacity growth that we are seeing. I mean, 50% of the global emission happens here, or 52%, right? And if you look at the capacity growth that's happening, renewable is ahead. Now the question is, can renewable alone lead this path? And that's where I go back to you. We talk of intermittency, we talk of stability. You need somebody to piggyback that technology. Storage is not enough today, and that's where you need a technology which can flex. I think gas has a merit there because that's a technology which can flex to, it can ramp up to 88 megawatts per minute. So when renewable goes off, gas takes in. It is capable of taking the grid stability piece. But here's what I think would probably happen. And I'll tell you a story as I do that. There's a plant in Florida. It's called Debari. It's a Duke Energy plant, very interesting. Small 7E gas turbines, 80, 85 megawatt gas turbines, 3 of them. They were in a point where they were struggling with fuel efficiency, CO2 emission. They brought in massive solar in the same facility, about 74.5 megawatt of solar. Now you know that today we struggle putting more than 25% on grid for renewable, given not just the intermittency, but the stability piece. So they could put only so much solar on grid. So they had excess solar on ground, which they're not able to dispatch. Now what to do with that? They were using that to produce green hydrogen, which fed into the gas turbine. Remember, the whole transportation piece was shrunk to one site. The storage was shrunk to 2.5 tons. About that. That's the kind of solution I feel the market will slowly work towards, because it's a transition, it's not a switch. It will not happen instantaneously. We have to, and I know in the previous panels we talked about coal is still going to be a reality, and it's going to be a decade before we actually see coal taking a downward turn, a significant downward turn. That's where another solutioning comes in, which is CCUS technology. Indonesia is amazing in that. And we are partnering, we're doing a couple of projects there in Indonesia. So I think it's policy, partnerships, solutioning. We don't talk enough of that, and I think that's a big piece. So Paula, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I also work in Australia with a retail company and used to be the regulator there. So, you know, I still got some feet in there. We have had instances, particularly in South Australia, where you go from 100% renewable, the grid's using 100% renewable, and then all of a sudden you've got a wind drought, and you lose 90%. And what are the technologies other than gas? Batteries, great for a certain period of time. Can you do to help with that
Absolutely.
flexibility. So that's one. And then the other one is, this is very complex stuff. And when you want to go to financing, if you're a renewable energy retailer like the company I'm with, or you're looking at some of these projects, you might, take a while to get your board over the learning curve on that one, but then you've got to explain it to who you're going to go and get the funding from. And I hope that's a good tee up to pass over to you, if you don't mind, Ganesh, in terms of what are the key issues that you're looking at in terms of assisting on financing this, the bankability of these projects?
Yeah, thanks, Paula, and you did tee it up pretty well. What I'd say is, let's say we've concluded that Asia is a heterogeneous market region, right? So each country is its own path of transition. It has its own fiscal capacity to finance that transition. And yesterday in one of the panels, Kim In also mentioned saying the resource-rich countries then have to find ways to get the resource or the energy into countries who can afford it, and Singapore is an example. So that's one important thing. So traditionally in Asia, power sector financing has been very localized. So there were generation capacities which were set in country. They supplied to utilities within the country, provided a stable cash flow profile to banks, and the banks were pretty good at channelizing, catalyzing capital, both debt and equity, into those markets to finance those power sectors, right? So it was about moving capital across borders. Now the whole regional transition will necessarily mean that the infrastructure has to be shared between countries. So the generation is sitting in one country, you have an interconnector between two countries, and you're sharing that infrastructure. Now sharing cannot happen without collaboration within the country. So you are effectively, as a bank, we are looking for that kind of a stability and an ecosystem where countries agree that the framework within which this sharing will happen. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second is in terms of the market structure itself. If you, generation in the past, right, if you say fossil fuel generation, provided stable base load generation and a stable set of cash flows. Now, how do you get renewable energy to get the character of dispatchable energy? And fossil fuel generations were dispatchable energies. You could ramp up and ramp down gradually. You need to be able to bring renewable energy through various technologies to be able to be dispatchable. Now, what this entails, and purely because of the technologies, they will be able to offer a certain amount of capacity as baseload, as stabilized generation, and there will be a certain surplus which either has to be sold in the spot market, or you need to find a buyer who is willing to take it whenever it's available. And we also heard yesterday, I think Singapore was also looking at demand response systems and battery systems and everything. So this demand response system is going to be able to capitalize and buy that power at the time that the surplus is available. And it's also very pertinent you mentioned Australia, when it ramps up, goes from 100 to 10. Essentially, those demand response systems can then, in fact, move across. So the critical thing is, one, we need to think about the infrastructure and how it's going to be shared and as financed as a shared infrastructure. Second, the market structure has to evolve. And that is where corporates who are coming into the market as direct buyers can then pick and choose at what time of the day do they buy the energy when it is most beneficial to them. And that will provide the certain, it will move the demand curve in a manner that renewable energy can provide. Okay. Lastly, we spoke about the grid itself. Now, grids across the countries in Asia Pacific are not homogeneous. They have different capacities. So the grids themselves need to have technical standards or be able to have a pretty good standard and have the resiliency to be able to absorb that intermittency of power itself. And that provides the interplay of all these factors, I think, are key ingredients to make a structure or a project bankable in that sense. And then obviously, as a bank, we've been leading project financing in the region. We have financed everything from solar, wind, batteries in Australia. We have financed transmission grids in India as well, transmission lines as well. In fact, we are moving a bit further. We went upstream to finance even the minerals and the batteries which are going into the energy transition. So putting together a bankable structure becomes easier when you have some of these key ingredients coming together.
Anybody want to comment?
Yeah,
Comment on that, yeah?
I think you're spot on. You're spot on the complementary nature of the technologies. But also, I think grid has gotten a stepsister attitude for a long time. We took it for granted. It's there, it'll work, dump in any technology you want, right? But I think there's a realization today that not only the infrastructure, but how we have set in the protections and enablers in the grid. It's not meant for a switch in, switch off. It's meant for an inertia machine. Now, as the transition happens, we need to relook at that. And maybe you guys have heard Scott this morning. We're trying to leverage AI into that picture so that the carbon intensity that is produced collectively in that area is managed well. I think that's where the other piece of the story comes in.
Can I just make a comment? Yeah. So I think this demonstrates the importance of an interconnected ASEAN, because if we have this interconnection, it will create a bigger grid, and then we talk about the reliability and the the integrity of the grid. And the other thing is that it allows us to integrate a bigger proportion of these intermittent power sources like wind and solar. The issue with wind and solar is that you can only get power when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. The rest of the time you need a backup system to do that. But if you have an integrated grid, then you can bring in base loads like hydropower, for example, in region like Sarawak or in Cambodia or Laos, and that actually sets the base load for the system, and then you can integrate and bring in more intermittent power sources like PVs and wind. So I think the ASEAN government need to realize that, and they need to make sure that they facilitate the development of this trans-ASEAN power grid, and which we have been talking since 2009, but you only have a few examples to have for the last couple of years. So we need a more comprehensive framework for us to make it work. The private sector like us can only do so much. We need government support, and we need the political will from the governments to make sure that this works. And our experience is that we cannot do this alone, because if the private sectors, business to business, utility to utility, we can work well. But then you have problem with the framework, because these are cross-border interconnection, and you have political risks, you have sovereignty risks that you need to deal with, and that increase the cost for the project. But if we can get a framework, a real framework to move this forward, I think we can make the ASEAN power grid a reality.
Thank you. And I think, as we heard from the minister from New Zealand yesterday, is in really getting across the point that everybody's going to benefit. I mean, it sounds a little corny, but perhaps because it's true, that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. Roberto, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's all true, and it all sounds very complex, because it is very complex. It is like a big puzzle, right? We're trying to move different pieces around. If you play with puzzle, usually the difference that in a puzzle, eventually there is a solution in this one. Here we don't know. We have different potential solutions. We will only know in many years from now exactly what it will look like. But we have a few metrics that had to guide us, which is reduction of emissions, continuing providing reliable, affordable, sustainable energy, and so on. But maybe I would like just to give a little contribution on a positive note here today, which is looking at the example, which I think we are quite lucky to participate, which is this regional project. It is a regional project between Singapore and Indonesia. right, to produce large-scale green electrons to be imported into Singapore. Well, this is the result, first of all, of the will, of the strong will, and as someone else has said before, aggressively pragmatic approach that both Singapore and Indonesia had taken over the past few years. And this approach has culminated a couple of months ago at the Indonesia International Sustainability Forum, where the place where 5 projects were awarded a conditional license to import, blah, 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 blah. Really, the whole process has been, and I've been lucky enough to follow some of these, the actors, the governments, first of all, focusing on what does each country needs, what does each country want. So first focus and understand what are the benefits you're both chasing. Once you understand the benefits, then you can better understand and address the challenges. And I think this has pretty much been the mindset that has allowed Singapore and Indonesia to make so much progress. Obviously, you have a very interesting situation in this region. You have a region is growing, we have natural resources in Indonesia, but we have the most developed market is in Singapore. Singapore has the means, has the financial capabilities, has the market sophistication to pay the premium for expensive renewable energy, but doesn't have the land resources. And in our case, it's a project that produced, in order to deliver 600 megawatt to Singapore, well, we're going to install panels in maybe around some 3,000 hectares of land. It's not a small thing. So 3,000 hectares of land to produce 600 megawatt to be available here in Singapore. And then, okay, so we got the land, we can get the permits. We have identified that this sort of project can find a premium market in Singapore, not today in Indonesia yet. Well, that's why we're here. But once we are able to start and develop this, which I think we will be able to get there, then this, I think, will create the momentum for more projects, for more deployment of new technologies, for more or better understanding, if you wish, of what governments need to do and what policies need to be put in place for make this interconnectivity more and more of a reality.
Thank you. There's a lot in there, and I like your puzzle analogy, because I'd probably start by even saying, are we sure we've all got the same puzzle? Or at least we all think we're trying to solve the same puzzle. Is there anything else that somebody wants to share in terms of how can countries work together to put the steel in the ground in order to get the interconnectivity that, you know, I think we all agree, and we certainly were all agreeing with yesterday, that we need to not only facilitate decarbonization and meet our 2050 targets, but also continue to meet demand and grow our economies.
Yeah, maybe I add something to that. If you look at the decarbonization challenge, right, all the countries have the SDG goals, the net zero goals, right? And to my mind, we don't have dearth of resources in terms of renewable energy, green energy, but we have dearth of interconnectivity, right? It could be pipelines, it could be transmission grids. My sense is it's important that we qualify all this interconnecting infrastructure as a national security infrastructure, which probably has to be developed by the governments in the region. Private sector is very well adept to developing generation as a sector, right? We have a lot of use cases. Generation is a successful model, we can do it. Transmission distribution, unfortunately, is not that big a successful model in private sector, right? If governments can come together and have alignment on policies to develop regional transmission infrastructure as a national security infrastructure, fund it in collaboration with multilaterals. We talked about institutional finance being available, right? Make it an open access infrastructure with regulatory return-based mechanisms. I think there's a lot of unlocking of capital that could happen. We don't necessarily have to go to commercial banks to get them funded, because there's a lot of institutional capital looking at long-term deployment for infrastructure as an asset class. So if we can distinguish between generation being part of the private sector and transmission being part of primarily government-driven national security infrastructure. And to give an example, Singapore has set up a $5 billion energy security infrastructure fund as part of the previous budget. And the idea is that, right, how do you secure your energy procurement, right? And the energy trilemma that we have been discussing about security, affordability, and sustainability, I think security to all the countries is most important because the entire economic spin-off depends on security. And to my mind, getting the grid, national infrastructure security grid going in the region is probably the most important thing for energy security.
You've thrown in a really good one, right? Just about we're ready to wrap up, and that is, in terms of how that ownership works, and where the role for the private sector is, and where the role for the government sector is. And I think we can probably all agree that the decarbonization we can't just hands off, leave it to the private sector to solve, such as many countries did during the microeconomic reform era. And we need to have that discussion at some point. I'd like to offer everybody on the panel an opportunity to make another point or even a call to action for those of us that are sitting in the room before everybody rushes off after this and goes to see the fantastic displays that are out there in the front room. So why don't we start going from left to right? What are, if there was one key thing you want people to leave with today, what is it?
So there will be few for me. One is a structured coal to gas switch, the right mix of renewable and gas, wherever means whichever country, hydro and nuclear makes sense, support that. Spend energy on grid, which means infrastructural development, smart grids, and orchestrate the whole of this through digital or AI. I think that will be my kind of 2 cents.
Yes, I see the fellow from Amazon here saying, absolutely. Okay.
Maybe a quick one. I would say mobilizing catalytic capital, primarily for multilaterals, because if they can mobilize capital, which is a first loss capital or underwrites some of the risks, then we can unlock a lot of commercial capital to come in. That would be important.
Thank you, Mr. Shabini.
Yeah. I think if we leave this to the government to realize, it will take a long time. So the private sectors needs to drive this effort. And of course, with the strong support from the government of the regions. And we need a strong political will to make it happen. Otherwise, we'll still be talking about ASEAN power grid, with only a few connections.
Thank you, Roberto.
Yes, I think maybe I just finish where I left it earlier. Understanding each party's needs and in the case of a solar import between a developing country, like Indonesia, and a rich developed economy like Singapore, it's pretty clear what Singapore needs, right? Is green power at an acceptable price, right? That can continue and foster attracting high-tech, sophisticated investment into Singapore. That's pretty clear. From the perspective of developing country like Indonesia, what do they want? What do they need? Well, revenues for exporting green energy is not the answer. It's not sufficient. What a developing country wants projects that can act as a catalyst for further investments upstream. In the case of our projects that can attract investments by manufacturers of solar photovoltaic panels, batteries, and the like, so that to bring local content, local development, employment, knowledge transfer. And so if you want, when we look at our projects, that is from our side, this added complexity that we need to be able to address in order to make this project
Thank you.
flying.
Yep. Actually, I've been Mr. Shabini's camp. I think private capital has a big role to play in the interconnectivity and the transition itself. So I'm more sanguine that private capital can be brought to bear to finance this whole transition, given a supportive state and cross-border framework. So that's one. Second, there is a role for multilaterals to play because not everything can be inked on a piece of paper. So you need some kind of risk coverage from the multilaterals to take the risks that commercial banks or private capital cannot take. So I would say there has to be a blend of the two to come together. And ultimately, international style, bankable project financing with an appropriate risk sharing probably is a formula for success.
Thank you. And I'm going to give myself a last word. And that is through yesterday and today, and perhaps with a bit of my regulatory hat on as well, is the issue of social license, is the issue of managing consumers' expectations, which goes into that political will, and also how do we collectively, not just governments, not just regulators, how do we collectively manage expectations for consumers and build the trust so that when your energy bills are going up, consumers are saying, you know what, I don't like this, but I understand why my bills are going up and I'm going to be better off tomorrow and my kids are going to be even better off in the future. So that's a little bit of hopefully a positive note to leave on. And I would like you all to join me with a big round of applause for a wonderful panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists for the insightful discussion. Let's have a photo.